Great. Welcome back, everybody. So I understand the live feed is back on, which is perfect because what we want is the live feed to be down for the consent agenda and back up for things like this. So thanks for everybody for doing that. So as everybody knows, for the last couple of years, what we've tried to arrange the board meetings between three segments: our board business, then a deep dive on one of the networks, and then a panel where we try to learn something as a board and as an organization. For the next board meeting, I'm going to turn over kind of structure of the board meeting to John. We can either continue with this or revamp it or do something a little bit different. But I figured as kind of as part of this board meeting today, we'd try to get John to know John a little bit better. And as I said in the previous segment, we're fortunate to have a incredible interviewer and former journalist, managing editor of Time, Rick Stengel, who also appears many times on Morning Joe. I only know that because I see you on Morning Joe and I watch it. And a member of our board, and also a full-time job as Undersecretary for Public Affairs for the State Department. Probably these days used to answering questions more than asking questions, which is funny because John Lansing's probably asking a lot of questions these days and not answering a lot of questions. So we decided to flip the tables a little bit today for our panel and use this as an opportunity to get to know John a little bit by flipping the tables and have Rick return to the role of asking questions and John take the stage and having to answer some questions. So with that, let me turn it over to the professionals. Rick, take it away.
Jeff, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and you've touted my journalistic credentials, and now I'm going to use a term of journalism. This interview is what is known in the trade as a softball interview. So I'm delighted to have you here, John. I feel like we've gotten to know each other. As Jeff said, you're a unicorn in a very good way. And I guess what I'd throw out you're a media guy, I'm an old media guy. What is it about your media background that gives you insight or skills to help manage BBG?
Well, it's a great question. I've been in media for so long, I can hardly remember when I started. I started doing things like these gentlemen around us are doing, lighting studios and pushing cameras around, and then I moved on to the newsroom and started covering stories and carrying cameras on my shoulder, and never international, but had my experiences with union mobs and presidential elections and flash mobs that developed because the University of Louisville upset the University of Kentucky after 30 years when they would refuse to play them, which turned into one of the biggest riots I'd ever covered. I grew to have a passion and a love for what journalism means to communities. I also grew to have a lot of respect for the process of how you decide what you cover, how you cover it. I had moved into a role of managing editor, young along in my career, and then later news director in major cities like Chicago, Minneapolis, Detroit, and Cleveland. And when you see great journalists do great work and corrupt police departments get taken to task, or a corrupt school board taken to task, things that wouldn't happen without honest journalists doing really good work because they feel a mission to what they do. And the one thing that I've always felt about journalists, and myself as a journalist, I'm sure you feel this way as well, is that it is mission driven. And it's evident as I went around the newsrooms I visited here, including VOA yesterday, where we had a very, very active conversation at VOA. But it's all about mission, and I just relate to that idea. And as I moved along in my career and I went to the cable network business, there was a certain mission there, but it wasn't journalism per se. And the opportunity after I had left Scripps to sort of connect back with my roots and find that mission and then have it connect to something so vital to the United States government in terms of our role in the world as journalists, but covering these areas that are really, every day we pick up the paper or open our iPad, we see things are inflating around the world, and I think our role has never been more important. So in short, it's the connection of mission and the BBG's role in the world that really made me feel really drawn to this role.
I'm going to hop on what you just said and talk about mission because, and you know, I am a devout believer in the journalistic mission, but BBG in general and VOA in particular have a kind of dual mission, right? While the questioner was talking, I went to look at the VOA mission statement, and part of it is independent journalism, but some of it is, and part of it is, I forget the phrase, clearly and effectively illustrating American foreign policy. No journalistic organization outside of government has that mission as part of it. How do you, and I know this is a big question, how do you reconcile those two in the work that not only VOA does, but all of the services do?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and we had that discussion at the VOA newsroom yesterday. I think it's about understanding the foreign policy of the United States and having a way of expressing it in an articulate way, but also in an independent way. Mm-hmm. And you're not advancing foreign policy. In a way, you're covering it. And it becomes an important beat, if you will, in the role of journalists to, in covering it, make sure that it's clearly articulated and understood.
So, and we'll get back to that, because I'm not going to let you off the hook on that answer. So, but I thought it was your kind of laydown of these 5 priorities is really smart. As a media person, and I'm sure you feel the same way, everything kind of boils down to content, distribution, and audience. And so if you kind of divide up your priorities according to those things, let's talk a little bit about the content issues, and actually maybe we even start with distribution, which I know is one of your goals, is to basically digitize everything and ultimately make everything available on a mobile device, which is where everybody's going.
That's absolutely right. I would actually start with audience, because audience is how you get to digital. Right. And as any media professional knows, you have to start with an audience and build backwards, otherwise you don't know where you're going. And if anybody in media today, or anybody consuming media, knows we're at a great inflection point for consuming media, particularly younger audiences. Anybody with teenage kids understands that. And the way media is distributed these days is certainly television is still dominant and important, and certainly radio still is important in certain parts of the world. But increasingly and rapidly, the distribution of choice will be social media as a distribution platform, and mobility, the ability to have something what I want, where I want it, when I want it, and have control over the media experience. And that's really what the purpose around a transformational effort around digital media for the BBG is, simply because that's where the audience either is, or it's certainly where they're going. And to be inattentive to that would just be blind to a reality. You could argue in certain parts of the world it's going to be slower than other parts of the world, but it would be hard to argue that the whole world won't be there eventually. I may have lost my mic there, I don't know.
No, you've still got it.
Still got it. And so I think it's important for us to make sure we're at least on par with those rapid changes, if not ahead of them.
So that's distribution. So, yeah. I mean, so talk about audiences. So, I mean, one of the things I've seen at the State Department, we tend to sometimes, I think that we don't think so much about audience, we think about articulating policy. You have so many different, actually, vectors and audiences around the world. I mean, it's mind-boggling. How do you think about that?
Well, again, back to the spheres of influence that I was discussing earlier, I think there are audiences that are being impacted by decisions made in Russia, for example, that are advancing in places that we wouldn't have anticipated even 6 months ago. Mm-hmm. And then I think about what are the target audiences for us. Is it 54-year-old radio listeners? Is it young future leaders, influencers? Different audiences can have a different impact with the information that we provide them. And I think we have to be attentive to that if we want to measure impact. What's the impact we want to create, and how do we create that based on what audience we know we have to communicate with?
Right. I was also very favorably struck by your notion of curation and aggregation. And you know, one of the things that when VOA started, and I was thinking about this with the questioner too, there was a scarcity of information. There was a scarcity of journalism. You know, we were kind of put journalism in places where it didn't exist. Now there is a lot of journalism. So how do you also rectify the balance between what's out there and what VOA or BBG produces, and then what we can use in terms of what's already there.
Yeah, no, I have a mental picture of a news conference, say in Kiev or Prague or Paris, where there's 50 cameras covering something, and then we're the 51st and maybe even the 52nd camera at that event. And you're right, the news of the day, as we call it, is available and easily curated. And by freeing up resources that we could use for more contextual reporting, more perspective around issues, and doing what journalism does best and explaining complicated issues rather than just feeling like we're chasing hard news around the globe that's easily obtainable. And then even on the other side, when I think of part of the VOA charter is telling America's story, America's story is so rich and so outside of Washington when you think about it. And I think it's hard, very hard for any news organization. If you're NBC News, it's hard to tell America's story. It's expensive. But there are people who are telling America's story, so there may be a curation opportunity there, or an acquisition opportunity to have really rich American stories that can be told through the VOA so that our resources can be used for maybe the harder, more contextual perspective stories that need to be told.
And that kind of leads me to ask about the other leg of coordination, right? I mean, I guess when I first started visiting different BBG outlets, I was surprised by how little people were using each other's content. And to me, that's just a fantastic advantage to be able to use content that one of your affiliates has produced. Talk about coordination.
So I mentioned the formation of the ICC earlier, and that's the 5 entity heads, and we've had an opportunity to meet, as I said, and their work that they've done on their own in the last 2 weeks, pulling together a narrative for how they might work together going forward. And through this lens of spheres of influence, and what we saw was a very interesting, coming from the 5 entities, to me, of how they saw an opportunity to have VOA and RFE-RL work together here in this sphere, or MBN and VOA in the Middle East, even VOA and RFA in Southeast Asia. And so they can work in tandem and create greater impacts by having a more strategic approach at the high end, and at the low end, at the very least, have efficiency so that we're not covering the same stories under the BBG banner that could be either covered by one or covered by both in a more impactful way.
Right, that makes sense. One of the things, and we've talked about this, I know, and it's touched on a little bit this morning, but one of the things that I've seen since I've been in my job is actually the narrowing of the information space of freedom of information and freedom of speech. And one of the things that countries are realizing is that, you know, not all of your data has to flow through a server in Southern California or whatever, and that people are physically narrowing what happens in their country. And also these autocratic countries and the rise of autocratic countries are saying, man, you know, free speech is something that we're not necessarily in favor of. How do you, this is a kind of a turn of events that we hadn't really expected. How does BBG reckon with that?
Well, I think one way that I mentioned earlier would be the aggressive push for an open internet in areas where there's censorship of the internet. I think providing connectivity is perhaps job one. It's hard to do great journalism if you're not connecting with people through that platform.
Right.
It's difficult to do, it's expensive to do, but the work that's already been done by the BBG and RFA in particular shows that we can have measurable impact in opening up lines of communication in countries and regions where it's been stifled.
There's another phenomenon that's a corollary to that we've seen is in this era of the digital era where it's easier to get information and facts than any time in human history, there's an epidemic of disinformation and misinformation. You know, my old Senator Pat Moynihan used to say, you're entitled to your own opinions, not your own facts. But now more and more people feel like I'm entitled to my own facts,
right,
and my facts are different than your facts.
Right.
That's a journalistic issue. How do you deal with that?
You know what, that's a great question, and I think it's a place to underscore the importance of the firewall and of the credibility of our journalism, because the minute that our work is considered to be just another spin on a set of facts,
right,
then I think we've really given in. And I think there are immutable facts, right? There are, to Senator Moynihan's point, which I completely agree with. Somebody shot down the Malaysian airliner. It's knowable, probably, who did that. And spinning that all day on one side of the line versus finding out the truth through investigative journalism on the other, I think is the best way to have a distinctive voice that helps explain that or other more complicated issues in a way that highlights what's propaganda and what isn't.
Right, and I think that what the propagandists do is they use journalism instincts against us. I'll use that about myself in the past term. That so many journalists believe in objective journalism, so they feel like they have to say on the one hand, on the other.
Right.
Well, you know, as I tell my folks, there aren't two sides to a lie, right? You can't say, here's a lie on one hand, here's the truth.
And there's also, there are a lot of journalists that you and I have known speak, you know, about balance. And you see this on the cable news talk shows a lot, that there's something that's put forward that's inherently spun or untrue, and then somebody gets the equal amount of time to say that it's untrue. Well, there's more to any story than two sides. And to your point, amplifying the lie to give it equal weight to the explanation, I think, is in and of itself sort of a distorted approach to conveying information.
And there's no balance between falsehood and the truth, which is one of the issues here. So again, one of the questioners mentioned countering violent extremism, and I've been very involved in CVE in terms of that kind of messaging, countering the really noxious and pernicious messaging of so-called ISIS and Daesh, et cetera. How do you see that area as a purview of BBG?
Sure. I think it comes down to the verb that is used. I think if I'm at the State Department, the verb I would use is countering. As a United States citizen, that's the verb I would use. I think in a newsroom, the verb you would use is covering. And in covering Islamist extremism, you would also cover the policy. You wouldn't promote the policy, because the policy could be flawed. And a journalist, I think, would cover the policy and the issue and report evenly on that. But I think the role of the BBG is to be in those areas of the world that are identified as the key areas that matter the most to U.S. foreign policy.
So let's talk about U.S. foreign policy for a second, and you know, I'll give a great revelation, but people around the world don't always like our foreign policy. What is the and by the way, they oftentimes have very good reasons not to like it, which is what I tell the public diplomacy people. How does BBG in this new world do an even better job of being clear about what U.S. foreign policy is?
Well, I think that there's a firewall against promoting U.S. foreign policy and reporting on it, but that firewall, it shouldn't prevent us from understanding it as well as we possibly can.
Right.
Any journalist worth their salt covering any issue would want to understand it at its root.
Right.
And that would be no different for a U.S. foreign policy initiative than anything else a journalist would cover.
Right.
But ultimately, the journalist's mission and purpose is to seek the truth and report the truth as they believe it to be, and try to be fair and unbiased. And so therefore, you could contemplate that a journalist would understand the policy. Let's just take the policy towards Bashar al-Assad in Syria and have an analytical and critical point of view as to how that policy was developed and how it's evolved. But to do that, you'd have to understand it really well.
Right. So one of the things I talk about public diplomacy is that we want to foster understanding, and one of the things that fosters understanding is conversation and back and forth. And I always say, well, you know, we're not the government that just promulgates something. We're the government that listens to you. In this new era of digital and social media, it's so much about the conversation. To get BBG into the 21st century, how will you do that? How will you engage audiences? Because conversation and back and forth is the way you engage audiences.
Well, we're here today at MBN, and they have an incredible initiative that we're actually looking to amp up as we go forward. Raise Your Voice. Is that right, Brian? Raise Your Voice? Which is a really interesting mix of social media, radio talk shows. It's essentially putting MBN at the centerpiece of a conversation in the Middle East about what citizens in the Middle East believe should happen to improve the situation they have on the ground. And I think that's a really interesting approach to journalism that is citizen-based and is essentially giving voice to we all talk about in journalism, voice to the voiceless. This is literally giving that voice to the voiceless and amplifying it to create a new set of content that otherwise wouldn't exist.
John, you also said in your, the pillars that we have to make decisions about what we do. We can't be all things to all people, and basically the audience and distribution of BBG has been kind of almost everywhere, and we're in dozens and dozens of different languages. We're reaching small audiences here and there. How do you, you'll have to make some tough choices about where to, put your nickel, as it were. So you want to talk a little bit about that? And I know you've only been in the job a month.
Yeah, so I'll take that caveat. Okay. Thank you. My observation is that the world is dynamic and changes rapidly. As we've just seen, we defined largely the Russian influence that we were covering as that over Eastern Europe and Ukraine, and you wake up one day and they're bombing moderate fighters in Syria, and so all of a sudden the definition of the Russian sphere of influence expands overnight. And so I think we have to think about it in a little bit more nuanced way. I don't think it's about a country versus that country. I think it's about where are the major movements and spheres of influence for the largest actors in the world potentially moving, and being articulate about what that may be, number one. Number two, as I look at my early purview of our budget expenditures, and I look at the low, the bottom fifth, if you will, of the language services, it's really not a significant amount of money compared to the overall budget. It's not at all. But it gives us access into areas that otherwise the American perspective would be missing, and they, in many cases, shift into a situation where it's important that we're there. Mm-hmm. So I'm giving voice to your notion that is difficult, but I think that the best thing we can do is just be articulate and understanding of where we believe the best use of our resources can have the most impact. And if we find ourselves in an area that just is objectively outside of our mission, then we have to just make the decision to move those resources where they can be more impactful.
Are there places, I think we just have a few more minutes, right? But are there places where you feel like, man, I would like to, get our voice out there, or we really need to cover this particular area that's not being covered, or is there a sphere of influence that we're neglecting? I'm just curious, because you have a big machine to run here.
I'll speak to one that we are in and doing a fantastic job, but maybe need to even add more resources, and that's Indonesia. Mm-hmm. I visited our Indonesia service and had a great sit down with that team, a small pride and passion team driving that team. But as I listen to them and the way the politics of Indonesia have been shifting lately, and the largest Muslim democracy in the world, and what that means to us as Americans, and to imagine that could shift without our voice being heard as loudly as it could be, is something that I'm attentive to that. So It might not be an area where we don't have our resources today. It might be where we do have resources that we need to be even more heavy up even more. Mm-hmm.
And not to put you on the spot, are there things that you've already seen that BBG produces, or one of the entities produce, or VOA, and you think, wow, that's a great show, I'd like to expand that, or I was really impressed with this particular report. I actually thought the the False Paradise campaign that MBN is doing is Delusional Paradise, is that what it is?
Delusional Paradise.
Even better name, is something that's really terrific.
Yeah,
so,
I would have drawn Delusional Paradise out. I know RFA has done some significant documentary work that I have copies of that I'm watching. But I think the long-form, impactful, deeper, richer reporting around these issues versus the day-to-day spot news coverage, that's what I'm really interested in.
Terrific. So I'm going to make this the last question, and I was going to make it an early question, but we leapt right into it. And it's a pretty basic question. Why did you want to do this? And one of the things that when Jeff teed this up, we were looking for somebody who wanted to, do service. Not that I'm already predicting your answer, but let's talk about that a little bit.
So Jeff approached me originally about this, and I did some background research, as anybody would, and I had some questions about it. And Jeff, who I have been friends with and admire for a long time as a colleague in the cable industry before he went on to become a movie mogul.
He's quite the mogul.
But he said, just do me this favor, have a conversation with each of the governors, which I did with you and all of the governors. And I came out of those conversations hearing a consistent theme from all of you about your passion for this mission, that you were strategically together on this mission. And coming from a former position that I was in after Scripps, where I reported to a board, I knew inherently that reporting to a board required really two things: that you have a great board chair, and you have a board that is consistent and on mission. And when I heard that, then it really triggered my sense of patriotism for national service. My father was a World War II veteran in the Pacific. And I just felt like it was my way, in my stage of life, I had the opportunity to do what my dad did when he was 20 years old, and that is to serve my country.
Fantastic. Well, we are glad you're doing that, and I know you'll do a splendid job, and thank you for sitting down and talking with us today.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well done.
All right.
Wait, let me just say something before you guys end. I don't know if I can, but two comments. First of all, I do wanna thank Rick. Rick is also doing public service. You had an opportunity to do a number of other things in your career after leaving time, and you chose to come to the government, and you get on a train every Monday morning and leave your family and work down here and then go back. Incredible sacrifice, and I did want to kind of in front of all of us, you've been an incredible board member. Thank you for everything you've done for the country and for the board here. And then also just echoing the final statement, John, that you said. I think Carlos may have said it to me. I don't know if Carlos is still here somewhere, but after I swore John in, Carlos said to me, we all want to be looked at the way John's daughter looked at him while she was holding the Bible.
Yes.
And I think that summed it up perfectly. So I just, thank you in advance for your service. We all want our sons and daughters to look at us the way your daughter looked at you, and do something that we're proud of. And thank you to both of you gentlemen for your service, both now and hopefully for years into the future. So, and thanks for the panel today.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think now we're going to do a deep dive of MBN, so one more 10-minute break while we reconfigure the room. Michael Kempner, I don't know if you're still with us. Hopefully you are. And we'll be back in 5-10 minutes. Brian, your team will be up.